I hadn't even told my husband that my father's estate had cleared probate. $35 million, give or take. Before the notary looked up from her screen and said the county system showed I'd been divorced for 2 months. I sat there in a hard plastic chair under fluorescent light and said nothing for 5 seconds. Then I did one thing. I picked up the folder, thanked her, and walked out like a woman who still had somewhere important to be. Chicago, late October. The kind of afternoon where the wind off the lake turns Wacker Drive into a wind tunnel, and everyone walks with their chin tucked into their collar. My name is Nora Hale. I was 36 that year, and I was the CEO of Lakeside Analytics, a data infrastructure company headquartered on the 14th floor of a glass tower in Fulton Market. The title looked good on a business card. In reality, on the day we founded the company, my husband Daniel Callahan and I sat in a subleased office the size of a studio apartment, with a space heater that smelled like burnt dust and a Wi-Fi connection that dropped every time it rained. I ran the client relationships, the contracts, the money, the people. Dan ran the architecture, the servers, the code that looked like a foreign alphabet to me. Our first investor used to joke that Dan was the brain of the company and I was the spine. I used to smile when he said that. I was proud of it. Every woman wants to believe that she and her husband built something together, stone by stone, through the worst years, and that the building will hold. From 6 people crammed into that sublet, Lakeside Analytics grew to 140 employees across 2 floors. We landed a logistics contract with a Fortune 500 retailer. Our name started showing up in industry newsletters. But a company with its name in lights is not the same thing as a marriage with any light left in it. There are couples who stand shoulder to shoulder in the annual report photo, matching smiles, and then go home and run out of things to say to each other before the dishes are even done. Dan and I had been married 9 years. We had no children. For a lot of women, that single fact becomes a splinter that never quite works its way out. I'd been to 3 different fertility clinics in the city. I'd taken the medications on schedule, timed the injections, sat in waiting rooms that smelled like hand sanitizer and hope, and absorbed advice from doctors, from friends, from women at the gym I barely knew. Some of it came from genuine kindness. Some of it came dressed as kindness and landed like a slap. My mother-in-law, Patricia Callahan, was from a small town outside Dayton, Ohio, in her mid-60s, and blunt in the specific way that always seemed to find the softest part of you first. In the early years, she still treated me like family. Nora, eat something. You work too hard. You're too thin to carry a baby. I'd force a smile and take another spoonful of her pot roast, throat tight the whole time. At the Callahan family reunion every summer, she'd announce to the whole table that the only thing missing from our house was the sound of a grandchild calling her grandma. The table would go quiet for a beat before somebody laughed to break the tension. People do that. Say something cruel in front of a crowd and call it a joke. Talk is free. The damage it does is not. Every time Dan noticed me go quiet after one of those comments, he'd put a hand on my shoulder. Don't let it get to you. Medicine's come a long way. This isn't only on you. I believed him. I believed him so completely that on the nights he came home late smelling like someone else's perfume under the rain, I told myself he'd been at a client dinner. I believed him so completely that when he said the staging servers had crashed and he needed to sleep at the office, I texted him to remember to eat and to lay off the energy drinks. Once I asked him, gently, why he'd been so busy lately, why he barely made it home for dinner anymore. He didn't look at me. He unclasped his watch, set it on the counter, and said in a tired voice, "The Meridian launch is coming. Somebody has to carry that weight. You're the CEO, Nora. You get technical pressure better than anyone." I stayed quiet. In a marriage, the scariest thing isn't a fight. A fight at least means 2 people are still talking. The scariest thing is opening your mouth and feeling immediately like you're a burden for having done it. That evening, I made his favorite dinner: garlic mashed potatoes, a roast chicken, a salad with the dressing on the side, because he'd started watching his cholesterol. I'd picked the chicken myself from the butcher 2 blocks from our building, the same one who always slipped an extra sprig of rosemary into the bag. He'd smiled at me that afternoon. "For the husband, huh? You spoil that man." I'd smiled back. I still believed back then that a good dinner could hold a house together. I know now that it doesn't matter how well you cook if the person across the table wants to eat somewhere else. Dan got home past 8:30. He sat down, took 2 bites of the potatoes, 1 bite of chicken, and stood up. "I have to head back in. Production's throwing errors." I looked at his plate, still mostly full. "Eat a little more. You probably haven't eaten since lunch." "I'm full." He paused at the door. "Anything else, Nora?" I wanted to ask if he still loved me. I wanted to ask why he'd started looking at me the way you look at a piece of furniture that isn't quite broken enough to throw out yet. Instead, I said, "It's supposed to rain. Take your jacket." He grabbed his coat off the back of the chair and his voice softened, just slightly. "Just focus on the company. Let me worry about home." At the time, that sounded like an ordinary marital division of labor. Husband handles one thing, wife handles another. I had no idea that in his private definition of home, there was no longer a place set for me. After he left, the kitchen got so quiet I could hear the second hand on the wall clock. His fork was still resting against the rim of his plate. I stood there a long time, not understanding why my chest felt cold in a warm apartment. My phone lit up. A text from Patricia. "You coming for Sunday dinner? Did you go back to the clinic? I heard about a specialist in Columbus who's supposed to be a miracle worker." I read it and exhaled through my nose. Every time she brought up the clinic, I felt like a tree getting dug up by the roots so people could check if it was still alive. I typed back, "Yes, I'll be there." A minute later, another text. "A wife's most important job is still giving her husband's family a child. All the money in the world doesn't fix that, Nora." I set the phone face down on the counter. Out on the balcony, rain streaked sideways against the railing. The city below was lit up and moving. Cabs, restaurants, people laughing on a corner waiting for a table. Only our apartment was bright and cold, like a waiting room nobody wanted to be in. I used to think our marriage was just tired. We were business partners under real pressure. Funding rounds, family expectations, years of failed treatments. Anyone drifts a little under that kind of weight. The old saying is that a united couple can move mountains. I believed that if I gave more, endured more, loved harder, it would eventually add up to something solid again. But some leaks don't stop no matter how fast you bail, because while you're scooping water out of the boat with both hands, the other person is under the floorboards with a drill. That night, Dan didn't come home. Around 1 in the morning, he texted, "Crashing at the office. Lock the doors." I stared at that message longer than I want to admit. For the first time in 9 years of marriage, I didn't answer right away. I walked into the living room and looked at our wedding photo on the wall. Me in a simple white dress on my father's arm, Dan smiling like he'd never let go of my hand. I touched the cold glass of the frame. I still didn't know, standing there, that the man in that photograph had walked out of our marriage a long time before that night. He just hadn't gotten around to telling me. Or maybe he had told me, in the cruelest possible way, and I simply hadn't been paying attention. Years before all that, when I first felt the house starting to cool, I held on to a simple rule my father had given me. If you help someone along their road, they don't owe you anything for it. Just don't let them turn around and shove you into a ditch. But life doesn't sign a moral contract with anybody, and I learned that the hard way, starting on a trip I took with my father back in the fall of 2015. My dad, Walter Hale, had built a small chain of hardware supply distributors across the Midwest, the unglamorous kind of business that quietly made a lot of money over 30 years. He despised loud charity photo ops. He used to say that if you help people but take more pictures than you ask questions, you're not doing charity, you're feeding your own reflection. I laughed at him for it once. "You're impossible, Dad. How does Mom put up with you?" He looked at me, and there was real warmth under the gruffness. "Being strict about money and about kindness saves you a lot of grief down the road, kiddo. There's real suffering in this world. There's also people who've learned to use their suffering like a fishing rod." I figured he was just a cautious old man who'd been burned once or twice. I had no idea that sentence would come back to me years later like a splinter under a fingernail. On that trip, we drove out to a hollow in eastern Kentucky, the kind of place fog sits in the valley all morning and doesn't burn off until noon. The kids there wore coats 2 sizes too big, cheeks chapped red, watching our rental car with eyes that were curious and wary in equal measure. That's where I met Tessa Marsh. She was 22, thin, pale, with the kind of eyes that always look like they're one sentence away from crying. She hung back behind her mother, Carol Marsh, twisting the hem of her sweater in both hands. The moment Carol saw my father, she broke down. "Please, sir, you have to help us. I owe people money and they're going to marry my girl off to some man twice her age to settle the debt. She's not even old enough to know what she's agreeing to. As a mother, it's tearing me apart." Tessa dropped to her knees in front of my dad. I rushed over, panicked, and pulled her up by the arm. "Please stand up. Let's just talk. You don't have to do that." She grabbed both my hands. Hers were freezing. "Ma'am, I don't want to marry him. I want to finish school. I want a job. I don't want my whole life to end in this holler." Looking at her, I felt like I was looking at a young tree bent almost flat by wind. I felt real pity for her. Maybe because back then I still believed that tears always arrived attached to something honest. That's a fairly naive belief, and it seems like everybody eventually pays a price for their naivety. After talking to a local pastor and a county caseworker, my father learned that Carol had taken out a predatory short-term loan, not a huge amount to start, but in the hands of the men collecting on it, it had swollen the way debt does when nobody's watching the interest. That night, in a motel room with water stains on the ceiling, I told my dad, "I want to help her." He poured hot water from a kettle into 2 mismatched mugs and asked, slow and even, "Are you helping because you feel for her, or because you want to feel like a good person doing it?" I sat with that a second. "I really do feel for her, Dad." "Then help with a clear head. Don't hand over money and expect gratitude to grow out of it like a crop." I stayed quiet. He put a hand on my shoulder. "Doing right by someone is still the right thing to do. But kindness needs a fence around it, Nora. Without a fence, decent people turn into a welcome mat real fast." I nodded. Though honestly, I didn't fully understand him yet. After that trip, I used my own savings to pay off just over $11,000 of Carol's debt. I didn't hand over a stack of cash like in a movie. I had a local attorney draft a settlement letter, paid the balance in structured installments, and had it filed with the county to close the loan out cleanly, with the sheriff's office as a witness. My dad hated verbal favors. He said they always came back around as obligations nobody had agreed to in writing. I thought that was the end of it. But Tessa kept crying, telling me that if she stayed, her mother would end up in debt again within a year, and could she come with me to Chicago instead? She'd wash dishes, wait tables, learn a trade, anything. She wasn't afraid of hard work. I looked at my dad. He didn't nod right away. He just asked her, "Tessa, do you want to leave to build a life, or to hold on to somebody else's?" She wiped her face and said quietly, "I want to be able to support myself." That answer softened something in me, and I brought Tessa Marsh back to Chicago with us. For the first few months, I rented her a small studio near a community college, paid her tuition for a UX design certificate, and bought her a secondhand laptop that actually ran. I took her grocery shopping, taught her the CTA system, taught her how to budget on a part-time paycheck, and warned her, gently, not to trust city people too fast. She was humble in those days. Every time she saw me, she'd practically bow. "Nora, I owe you my life." I didn't like the word owe, so I always brushed it off. "You don't owe me anything. Just live decently. And if you're ever in a position to help somebody else, do it." Once she came by our apartment while Dan was repairing his laptop at the kitchen table. She stood there shyly. "Hi, Dan. Nora says you're a wizard with computers." He glanced up and gave her a polite smile. "Not really. I'm just used to it." She looked at the screen full of code, eyes lighting up. "It looks like something out of a hacker movie. If I understood any of that, I'd feel like a genius." He laughed. I laughed too. I even said, half joking, "You should teach her some basics sometime. She's learning design. A little back-end knowledge would make her way more employable." Dan said, "Sure, when I've got time, I'll show her something." An entirely ordinary sentence. I had no reason to think twice about it. Who could have guessed that some things start with a sentence as light as a speck of dust and end up as a hurricane that levels an entire house? A year or so later, as her skills improved, I put in a good word for Tessa at a partner agency for an internship. She started dressing sharper, talking with more confidence. On holidays, she'd text me and my dad both. Nora gave me a whole second life. My dad read one of those texts once and gave a dry smile. "Don't get drunk on somebody's gratitude, kid. People who are genuinely grateful usually don't have to say it that often." I told him he was suspicious of everybody. "I'm not suspicious," he said. "I just don't hand my house keys to somebody because they cried convincingly." I ignored that, the way the young and generous usually do. Kindness in its younger years tends to believe it shines bright enough to light up every shadow for other people. In reality, some shadows know exactly where to stand, so the light never touches them. Some months later, Tessa said her mother had gotten sick and asked for time off to go home. I sent extra money for medical bills, told her to call if she needed anything, and weeks turned into 2 months. Her texts got sparse. Sometimes I called and she didn't pick up. When she finally came back to the city, she looked thinner, and there was something sharper in her eyes that hadn't been there before. I asked if everything was okay back home. She looked down and forced a smile. "I'm just tired, Nora. Mom's better now." I didn't push. Everyone's entitled to a private corner they don't want to talk about. I respected that then. Looking back now, all I feel is a bitter kind of clarity. There are blank stretches in other people's lives, and if you don't ask hard enough about them, they eventually come back around to punish you in a way you never saw coming. My father died on a day it rained without letting up, from before sunrise until well after the sun should have set again. It fell steady on the hospital awning, on the wet trees outside, on the shoulders of everyone who came to say goodbye. I stood by the casket, hands numb with cold, half listening to the eulogy, feeling completely hollowed out. Walter Hale spent his whole life running a business carefully. He lived plainly, treated people fairly, and was never easy to fool. He taught me how to read a balance sheet, how to structure a deal, how to judge a person past whatever they were saying out loud. I forgot that last lesson in my own marriage. On the day of the funeral, Dan stood beside me in a black dress shirt, solemn, occasionally resting a hand on my shoulder in front of the relatives. "Stay strong. You've still got me." I believe that sentence completely. My father's will took nearly a year to clear probate, tangled in the layers of holding companies he'd built over 3 decades. In the end, the number that came out the other side of all that paperwork was $35 million. Real estate, a controlling stake in the distribution business, and a trust account, all of it structured as separate property, explicitly excluded from any marital estate, in his own handwriting on the addendum. My father's attorney, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Diane Brooks, who'd handled Hale family business for 20 years, called me in for the final signing. That was the morning everything changed. I remember the room smelled like toner and old coffee. The notary, a heavy-set woman with reading glasses on a beaded chain, pulled up my file to confirm my marital status for the asset transfer paperwork, standard procedure for separate property designations. She frowned at her screen, then looked up at me. "Ma'am, I'm showing here that your marriage was dissolved back in August. Is that correct? Because if so, we'll need to update the filing status before we can proceed." I sat there in that hard plastic chair for exactly 5 seconds. I know because I counted, the way you count things when your brain is trying to buy itself time to catch up with what your ears just heard. Then I did one thing. I asked her, in a voice that came out steadier than I felt, to print me a certified copy of whatever the county had on file. I didn't cry. I didn't call Dan. I thanked her, took the folder, and walked out of that office like a woman with somewhere else to be. I sat in my car in the parking garage for a long time before I could make myself dial anyone. Diane picked up on the second ring. "Nora, what's wrong?" I told her, flat and clipped, like I was reading a status report instead of my own life. She went quiet for a second, and then her voice sharpened into the tone she used for actual legal crises instead of routine ones. "Don't go home yet. Come straight to my office. Bring the copy." When I got there, she'd already pulled up the county records on 2 monitors. She turned one toward me. "Look at this. Filed August 4th. Uncontested, no-fault dissolution, both parties' signatures notarized, property settlement attached. Your signature's on all of it, Nora." I stared at the page. My own handwriting looked back at me from a stack of paper I had no memory of creating. "I signed my own divorce without knowing what it was," I said, and it didn't even sound like a question anymore. Diane nodded slowly. "Highly likely. Yes. Think back. Did Dan bring you a large stack of documents to sign recently? Anything around the time your father went back into the hospital?" I closed my eyes and made myself remember. My dad had just been readmitted to the ICU. I was splitting every day between his hospital room and the office, running on 4 hours of sleep and vending machine coffee. Dan had come into my office one afternoon with a leather portfolio and set it on my desk. "Need you to sign a few things. The funding round's got a stack of addendums attached." I remember asking if anything was important. He'd laughed, easy and light. "Wouldn't need your signature if it wasn't, but it's all internal boilerplate. Just sign so we hit the deadline." Looking back, I wanted to slap myself. People say you can sign your life away with one stroke of a pen. I did exactly that, and then thanked my own husband for handing me the pen. Diane flipped to another page. "Here's another flag. All legal correspondence on this filing was routed to your corporate office, not your home address. There's a limited power of attorney here, authorizing receipt of legal notices at Lakeside headquarters. If a court notice landed there, who would actually get their hands on it first?" I looked up immediately. Marlene. Our office administrator, who'd been with the company almost since the beginning, ran the mailroom and the front desk. We weren't close, but she'd never given me a reason not to trust her. "Could Dan get to her easily?" Diane asked. I laughed, dry and humorless. "He's my husband and the CTO. He has access to every floor of that building. Asking an admin to set aside one specific envelope is nothing. It's easier than asking someone to refill the coffee machine." Diane made a few notes in her legal pad without looking up. "The picture's getting clearer. He used the restructuring paperwork as cover, then intercepted the court's correspondence at the office before it ever reached you. And you were exhausted from your father's illness, so you weren't reading every page as carefully as you normally would." My throat burned. I want to call him right now. I want to look him in the eye and ask him what he thinks I am. Diane's response came fast enough to stop me cold. She looked me dead in the eye. Listen to me. If you blow up on him now, he'll know you've found out. And who controls every piece of core infrastructure at your own company? He does. You think he's going to stand there and let you take him apart? I went quiet. She lowered her voice, slow and deliberate. You are fighting two separate wars right now. 1, you were defrauded out of your own marriage. 2, you have to keep this company from collapsing before your Q4 launch. If you swing out of anger, you might win one shouting match. You'll lose the whole board. I sat back in the chair and let every word land where it needed to. She was right. I was in pain, but I hadn't lost my mind. That company wasn't just my money. It was my father's belief in me made real. It was the livelihood of 140 families, built on years of my own team staying up past midnight to close contracts nobody thought we'd land. Diane slid a copy of my father's estate documents across the desk. Remember this too. Everything your father left you is explicitly separate property under Illinois law. Legally, this divorce, fraudulent as it clearly is, actually cuts Dan off from any claim to your inheritance. Whatever he thought he was accomplishing, he accidentally severed his own access to your biggest asset. I looked at my father's careful, deliberate language in that trust document, and my eyes stung. He was gone, but somehow he was still standing behind me, blocking the wind. What do I do now? I asked quietly. Build your case, piece by piece, Diane said. From today forward, you read every single page before you sign anything, no exceptions. Back up every email, every text, every calendar entry around the dates he brought you paperwork. Check the office security footage if it's still on the server. Check the mailroom log. And whatever you do not let him know you've woken up. I bit the inside of my cheek. Woken up. It sounded gentle. It cut deep anyway. It meant I'd been sleepwalking through my own marriage for longer than I wanted to admit. I left her office and didn't go home. I sat in my car a long time, hand resting on the folder, terrified that the second I let go of it, the whole thing would collapse into a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. The rain had thinned to a mist. Inside my head, though, 100 questions were slamming into each other at once. If I hadn't seen that decree with my own eyes, I might have gone to my grave, believing my husband had simply grown distant, never imagining he'd calmly built a trap inside our home, inside our company, inside every piece of paper I'd trusted him enough to sign without reading twice. That night, I drove straight back to the office instead of home. Most of the floor had already cleared out. I sat down at my desk, opened my email, and started digging through old folders, meeting logs, every attachment Dan had ever sent me. I found the documents I remembered signing and built a timeline, dates, stated reasons, who'd physically handed them to me. Then I pulled up the internal camera footage around the mailroom for the weeks the court would have mailed its notices. Half of it had already cycled out of storage, but what remained was enough to point me in the right direction. On my way out, I passed Marlene's desk. She was packing up for the night. She looked up, surprised. Nora, you're still here? I kept my voice perfectly ordinary. Yeah, tracking down some old files. Hey, do you know where the incoming mail log from earlier this year is filed? She hesitated, just a half-second too long. Oh, it's in the admin cabinet. I can pull it for you tomorrow? I said, tomorrow was fine. That tiny hesitation was enough, all by itself, to turn something colder in my chest. That night I didn't cry, which surprised me. That morning I'd been hollowed out in a government office. By that evening I was sorting evidence like an entirely different person. Maybe that's what real pain does when it's too large to scream about. It doesn't give you the luxury of falling apart. It forces you to grow up overnight, standing in the wreckage of your own life. Out in the parking garage, streetlights smeared across the wet pavement, I pulled out my phone and called a number I hadn't dialed in years. Tom Reyes picked up on the third ring, an old college friend who used to work corporate fraud investigations and now ran his own small private intelligence firm out of the West Loop. Nora, it's been a while. I didn't waste time. Tom, I need a favor, and it's not a clean one. A pause on the line. What's going on? I looked at traffic streaking past, the cold wind off the lake cutting straight through my coat. I need a full, accurate picture of my husband's actual schedule, not the one he's telling me. Tom didn't ask a single unnecessary question. Give me a day. I'll see you tomorrow. I hung up and looked up at the gray Chicago sky. My father spent his whole life teaching me to read everything before I signed it. I forgot that lesson once, and the price was my entire peaceful life. From that night forward, I promised myself I'd never forget it again. Every comma, every glance, every uncharacteristically gentle word out of Dan's mouth was going to have to answer to me from here on out. I met Tom the next morning at a small coffee shop tucked behind the trees in Printers Row, quiet enough that the espresso machine drowned out most of the street noise. He was already there, sleeves rolled up, a black coffee going cold in front of him. He looked me over and frowned. You look like hell. I pulled out the chair across from him and gave him a dry smile. Your opening lines never change. He slid a glass of water toward me. What's actually going on with Dan? I didn't give him a speech. I just handed him the divorce decree, a handful of recent texts, and the business travel itinerary Dan had given me for the week. Tom read through all of it slowly. When he finished, he leaned back and exhaled through his nose. Nora, this isn't just an affair anymore. Tell me how far you actually want me to take this. I'll stop exactly where you tell me to stop. He wasn't looking at me with pity. His eyes were sharp, alert, all business. That was exactly what I needed. If he'd patted my shoulder and told me to stay strong right then, I probably would have laughed in his face. When your house is on fire, sympathy that thin doesn't put out anything. I only work clean, Tom said. Verified schedules, locations, public records, financial trails, no break-ins, no illegal wiretaps. I don't need to play dirtier than him to beat him. Understood, I said. Later that same day, he sent me a short text. Dan's not in Denver like he told you. He's in Naperville. Attached was a pin for a luxury high-rise on the river, not far from a property I'd driven past 100 times without a second thought, admiring the lit balconies and assuming, the way you do, that the people living up there had it easy. It turns out peace doesn't come from the floor you live on. I drove out and parked across the street. Tom was already posted up by a corner pharmacy pretending to check his phone. He got into my passenger seat when he saw my car pull in. You sure you want to see this? I stared straight ahead at the building's front entrance. I'm already here. If I don't look, I'm just lying to myself all over again. He didn't argue with that. He handed me his phone. Fresh photos filled the screen. Dan getting out of his car in a pale blue button-down, the watch I'd bought him for our 7th anniversary catching the light on his wrist. Beside him was Tessa Marsh, hair down, in a cream-colored dress, none of the rough, guarded look of the girl who'd hidden behind her mother in that Kentucky Hollow years earlier. She was polished now, composed, clearly aware of her own best angles in front of a camera she didn't know was there. But the thing that actually stopped my breath was the little boy standing between them, maybe 3 years old, fair-skinned, dark curly hair, holding a plastic dinosaur in one fist. Dan crouched down and adjusted the kid's beanie. Tessa brushed something off his shoulder, laughing at some private joke. The boy looked up and said something I couldn't hear through the phone screen, but I read it off his lips clearly enough. Daddy. My ears started ringing. Tom kept his voice low. Doorman calls him Eli. They're on the 18th floor. Neighbors think it's a normal married family. Dan comes by 3, 4 times a week, sometimes overnight. I gripped his phone so hard my knuckles went white. Eli was over 3. That put his conception right around the time I was starting my second round of IVF, the exact stretch of months I'd spent sitting alone in clinic waiting rooms listening to doctors tell me to lower my stress levels, going home afterward to choke down bitter supplements a specialist swore by. All while Dan held me and said, "It's fine, we've got time." It turns out that we hadn't included me for a while. A minute later, the building's front doors opened. Dan came out carrying Eli. Tessa slipped her arm through his, and the 3 of them walked toward the parking structure together, easy, unhurried. The whole scene looked so ordinary it was almost obscene. No sneaking, no guilt in it anywhere. They walked like a real family walks, and I sat on the outside of my own life, watching through a car window like an extra in a movie I used to think starred me. I asked, voice hoarse, "Whose name is the condo under?" Tom pulled a thin folder from his bag. "Registered to a distant cousin of Tessa's, but the money trail underneath it is tangled. Some of it traces back to Dan's personal accounts. Some of it looks like it's tied to vendor payments out of Lakeside. I can only flag it from where I'm sitting. Confirming the full route means getting inside your actual corporate books." I gave a short laugh that felt like swallowing a fishbone. "He funded a second household with company money. I'll get someone on the books." I stared up at the glass tower, its windows throwing back the cold evening sky. Somewhere behind one of those windows, Tessa might be setting a table. Eli running circles around the couch, Dan washing his hands before dinner. Meanwhile, back at my own place, a roast chicken had gone cold on a plate more nights than I wanted to count, a fork left resting exactly where he'd set it down. People say what happens in the dark eventually comes into the light, but sometimes the light doesn't just expose one lie. It rips the whole bag open and shows you everything else inside it has been quietly rotting for years right alongside it. Tom glanced over. "You want to go up there?" I shook my head immediately. "No, not yet." What does that get me? A screaming match in a lobby? A phone video of the scorned wife making the rounds online for 3 days? I'm not free entertainment for anybody. I sounded steady saying it, but another version of me was screaming somewhere underneath, wanting to storm in there and ask Tessa why. Ask Dan how he could hold that little boy with the same arms that had held me through nights I thought I might not survive. I held her back. I had to. I pulled a tissue from my bag and dried my eyes before anything could actually fall. "Keep digging, Tom. Schedules, photos, the payment trail around that building, and especially the connections between Tessa, her mother, and any of our company's vendors." He nodded. "Done. But be careful. A man who fakes a whole divorce filing has more than one card up his sleeve." "I know. Where are you headed?" I checked the clock. Almost 7. "Home." "Back to him?" "Yeah. I want to see what version of himself he plays tonight." Tom didn't try to stop me. Maybe he understood that sometimes the person who's been betrayed needs one more good look at the person who did it, not out of any leftover hope, but to burn off the last bit of softness still hanging around in her chest. When I got home, the lights were on. Dan sat on the couch in a fresh shirt, hair still damp from the shower, a plate of cut fruit on the coffee table in front of him. He looked up, perfectly casual. "Why are you home so late?" I stood in the doorway a second. In the past, I would have explained I'd been at the lawyer's dealing with my father's estate. Instead, I just found it almost funny. Liars always want to know where you've been. I took off my shoes and set my bag down. "Had some things to handle?" He studied me. "Your eyes look red. Were you crying?" I walked past him into the kitchen to pour a glass of water, keeping my back to him. "Must be the rain." He was quiet a beat, then said, You've been too sensitive lately. Your dad, the company, the fertility stuff. If you keep bottling it all up, you're just torturing yourself. I stood there holding the glass and looked at the man in front of me. The same man who an hour earlier had carried a little boy calling him daddy into a high-rise on the river, now lecturing me about not torturing myself. I said very softly, "Yeah, I need to learn to stop torturing myself." He didn't catch it. Or maybe he did and decided it was easier to think I was just being a bitter, hormonal wife. Either way, it worked out fine for what I needed him to believe. In the weeks after that, I moved carefully. I didn't confront Dan. I didn't cry in front of him. I played the tired, overworked CEO he already assumed I was, and underneath that performance, I started rebuilding the entire company from the inside out. At an executive meeting about the Meridian platform launch, I proposed tightening our change management protocols. Every production deployment now needed a second signature. Every vendor contract over $5,000 needed a fresh review before renewal. Dan pushed back in front of the room. "Why make things so rigid? Tech needs flexibility to move fast." I looked at him evenly. "The closer we get to launch, the more precision we need. I don't want one undocumented change taking down the whole system on demo day." A few department heads nodded along. Dan didn't argue further, but I caught the calculation behind his eyes. I knew I had to tighten the leash exactly enough to control the risk without letting him feel it tightening. That night at home, he said, almost idly, "You've been unusually cautious at work lately, huh?" I hung my coat on the hook and answered without looking at him. "One careless mistake is enough to cost you everything. I mean, for the business." I turned and gave him a thin smile. For the business, and for life in general. He didn't respond. Maybe he didn't catch the second half. Or maybe he just filed it under bitter wife again and moved on. Fine. Let him. Late that night, I sat alone in my home office in front of 3 folders, labeled in my own handwriting: marriage, company, self-respect. Those 3 things used to live together comfortably inside one life. Now they sat apart from each other like 3 separate open wounds. But I knew I couldn't win anything while I was still crying about it. Moving forward meant patience, not the kind of patience that lets people walk over you, but the kind that lets you quietly tie every knot in the net yourself before you throw it. They say if you walk in the dark long enough, you start seeing ghosts. Except the ghost living in my house didn't wear a sheet in some graveyard. It wore a pressed button down, sat in the CTO's chair down the hall from mine, said the right thing at exactly the right moment, and kept a knife tucked behind its back the whole time. This time, I wasn't going to wait for the ghost to show itself. I was going to be the one who pulled the curtain up. I stayed late at the office more and more, and one particular evening, once the floor had emptied out, and the only sounds left were the HVAC hum and the cleaning cart in the hall, I was still sitting in a small conference room with our controller, Priya Shah. On the table between us, a laptop, bank statements, invoices, vendor contracts, and 2 cups of coffee gone cold hours ago. Priya pushed her glasses up, stared at the screen a long moment, and finally said, "Nora, this is bad." I sat up straighter. "Which account?" "It's not one account. It's an entire cluster." She turned the laptop toward me. A spreadsheet of vendor contracts filled the screen. System maintenance, cybersecurity consulting, office equipment procurement, backup server rentals. All of it sounded perfectly ordinary for a software company. But sometimes, ordinary is exactly where people hide the worst things, buried under enough boring line items that nobody bothers to check twice. Priya tapped one row. Marsh Technical Supply. Over the last 2.5 years, we've wired them a little over $170,000. I frowned. Who's that? On paper, they supply IT hardware and support. I ran the registration. The business address is a rundown duplex in a rough stretch of Gary, Indiana. No functioning website, no listed technical staff, no warehouse of any kind. She scrolled to the registered owner's name. Carol Marsh. My stomach dropped straight through the floor. Priya looked up. You know her? I didn't answer right away. I pulled out my phone and cross-checked it against everything Tom had already sent me. Yes. Carol Marsh, Tessa's mother. The woman who'd sobbed in front of my father years earlier, insisting she'd have to marry off her own daughter to settle a debt I'd ended up quietly paying off myself. Now her name was sitting right in the middle of my company's cash flow, like it had always belonged there. My mouth went dry. Keep going, Priya. She nodded and scrolled to another cluster of entries. These two. Big-sounding names. Apex Digital Group, North Point Solutions, Vanguard Tech Partners. The addresses don't hold up, though. One's a print and ship storefront. One's a virtual office suite. The phone number on the third one's disconnected. Every one of these contracts was proposed or approved directly by Dan. I stared at the running total climbing down the column. 80,000. 150,000. The numbers sat perfectly still on the screen and somehow still managed to swim in front of my eyes. Any actual deliverables? Invoices with details? Technically, yes, Priya said. But they're vague to the point of being useless. Technical support completed. Hardware delivered. Consulting services rendered. No serial numbers. No detailed logs. No names of who actually received anything. I closed my eyes for a second. For years, I'd trusted Dan completely with the technical side of the business, so I'd never scrutinized those budgets past the top-line totals, as long as contracts had signatures and products kept shipping on schedule. I'd essentially put a fox in charge of the henhouse and then wondered, mildly, why there were feathers all over the yard. That's honestly an insult to foxes. They at least have the decency to be discreet about it. Priya kept filtering. The deeper she went, the more the room seemed to close in around us. Money moved out of Lakeside into these shell vendors, then immediately transferred into personal accounts connected to Tessa's relatives, or got pulled out as cash the same day it landed. Some withdrawals lined up perfectly with the closing date on the Naperville condo. Others matched tuition payments at an upscale preschool. Some routed through an intermediary account before covering car payments, designer handbags, furniture deliveries. Priya set both hands flat on the table, voice tight with anger. Nora, this isn't a guy with someone on the side anymore. He's been bleeding this company dry to fund an entire second household. That phrase, second household, hurt in a strange new way I hadn't braced for. It wasn't the loud, gutting pain of seeing him hold that little boy, or the numb shock of finding out about the divorce. This was a colder kind of pain. The realization that every employee's paycheck, every contract I'd talked myself hoarse trying to close, every night my team stayed up late fixing a broken quote for a client, had quietly been siphoned off by the man sleeping next to me, just to build somebody else a home. What's the rough total? I asked. Priya scrolled a little further before looking up. Just counting what's obviously fraudulent so far? Around 810,000. There's likely more. I need time to go deeper. I laughed, very softly, an involuntary sound with no humor in it at all. $810,000. Unbelievable. He even kept a ledger of his own betrayal. Priya's eyes had gone red. You want me to bring in an outside forensic auditor? Not yet. The fewer people who know right now, the better our position. I pulled a brand new external drive out of my bag and set it on the table between us. Back up every voucher, every statement, every contract, every approval email. Nothing goes through company servers or company email. Log the time, source, and user for every file you save. Tomorrow, I'll have Diane seal a certified copy. Priya's voice came back firm. I'll start right now. As I was gathering my coat, my phone lit up. A text from Dan. "You coming home for dinner? Mom asked why you barely come around anymore." I looked at the message, then back at the spreadsheet of stolen money still glowing on the screen. His mother wondering aloud why I rarely visited, while her son quietly funneled my company's revenue into feeding an entirely separate family. It's remarkable how certain people manage to question a victim's morality out loud while their own is rotting under the floorboards the whole time. I didn't answer him. I just looked back up at Priya. "Keep working." It was almost midnight when we finally stopped. She locked 2 encrypted backups away, one for me, one in her personal safe, per her own strict protocol. I told her thank you, and she shook her head. "Don't thank me. I'm an accountant. Watching a company's money get drained like this makes my blood pressure spike on principle. We work like dogs to keep this place running, and someone just signs a form to steal it and fund a mistress on the side. Honestly, it's personally offensive to me." I laughed for real, for the first time in days. Not because anything was funny, because somewhere in this entire mess, at least one person still had the decency to be furious about the right things. Walking out past the engineering wing, I saw Dan's office light still on. He sat at his monitors wearing headphones, fully absorbed. The perfect picture of a dedicated CTO burning the midnight oil for the product. If I hadn't seen those numbers with my own eyes, I would still have believed every bit of that performance, would still have gone home feeling guilty for not appreciating him enough. But I had seen the numbers now, and the glow from his monitor didn't look like dedication to me anymore. It looked like exactly what it was. Sunday dinner at Patricia's came around before I was ready for it, the way it always does. Her house outside Dayton smelled like pot roast and the same lemon polish she'd used on the dining table for 30 years. Dan drove us both out, humming along to the radio like a man with nothing on his conscience, and I sat in the passenger seat rehearsing, silently, exactly how normal I needed to sound for the next 4 hours. Patricia met us at the door in her apron, already talking before we'd cleared the porch. "There you two are. Nora, you look pale. Did you go back to that specialist I sent you?" I told her I had an appointment scheduled, which was true, though not for the reason she assumed. Over dinner, between the mashed potatoes and the green bean casserole, she brought up children twice, unprompted. Once comparing me to a cousin's wife who'd just had her third, and once sighing loudly about how the Callahan name needed somebody to carry it forward. Dan, to his credit in that moment, told her to drop it, which almost made me laugh out loud, given everything I now knew about exactly which name he'd already decided to carry forward, and where. I smiled through the whole meal. I complimented her cooking. I asked polite questions about her garden. Inside, I was running through Priya's spreadsheet from memory, cross-referencing dates against the calendar on my phone under the table. It's an interesting thing, discovering you can hold 2 entirely separate versions of yourself steady at the same time. One laughing at a joke about green bean casserole, the other quietly building a case file against the man sitting across the table passing her the rolls. On the drive home, Dan reached over and rested his hand on my knee, an old habit from years back. "You did good in there tonight. She can be a lot." I looked out the window at the dark stretch of interstate and said, "She just wants what she wants. Can't really blame her for that." He glanced at me sideways, something flickering behind his eyes that might have been suspicion or might have just been road glare. "You've been different lately. Calmer, somehow." I gave him the smallest smile I could manage. Grief does strange things to a person, I guess. That seemed to satisfy him. It should have. It was, after all, technically true. 2 days later, Tom called with something new. "There's a guy circling Tessa. Name's Jake Dunlap. Small-time, mostly debt collection and skip tracing work. Some of it not entirely legal. He's been showing up outside her building twice a week for the last month. I pulled his record. Nothing violent, but he's the type who leans on people until they pay. I asked what he wanted with her. Not sure yet, but given what we already know about her mother's finances, I'd bet money it's leverage of some kind. Somebody who knows something and wants paid to keep quiet about it. I thought about that for a long moment after we hung up. A blackmailer circling the woman who was blackmailing my marriage, in a manner of speaking, felt almost too neat to be real, except that greed tends to attract more greed the way a wound attracts flies. I told Tom to keep an eye on it from a distance, nothing more. Whatever was brewing there, I didn't need to manufacture it. I just needed to be standing close enough when it finally boiled over. Around that same time, I brought in a cybersecurity consultant named Ray Ortiz, referred to me quietly by an old business school contact who vouched for his discretion above everything else. Ray had spent a decade doing infrastructure security for financial firms before going independent. I met him off-site, at a diner near Midway, away from any camera or badge reader that might report back to Dan. I laid it out plainly. My CTO had sole administrative control over our core systems, including what amounted to a master override capable of shutting down the entire platform. I needed that access quietly restructured, distributed, and audited before our public launch, without alerting the one person who currently held all the keys. Ray listened without interrupting, then said, "That's not unusual, unfortunately. A lot of companies let one person accumulate that kind of unilateral control because it's convenient, right up until it isn't. I can build a compartmentalized access structure, rotate the credentials, and log every attempted use of the legacy override, all without him ever seeing it happen, as long as we do it in phases and dress it up as a routine security certification ahead of launch." I asked how long. 3 weeks, if I have full access and nobody flags the work as unusual. I told him he had it. He asked one more question before we left the diner. "Does he know you know?" "No." Ray nodded slowly. "Good. Keep it that way as long as you can. Surprise is the only real advantage you've got against somebody who's had months to plan this." Over the following weeks, I moved through my own company like a woman conducting a very slow, very careful audit of her entire life. Ray's team ran their access review under the cover of a standard pre-launch security certification, the kind auditors and investors expected to see documented anyway, so nobody outside a tight circle thought twice about engineers pulling extra hours on infrastructure work. I had Diane quietly assemble a formal legal packet, cross-referencing Priya's financial trail with Tom's surveillance timeline and the county's fraudulent divorce filing, building towards something clean enough to hand to both a civil attorney and, eventually, the local district attorney's office. Diane warned me more than once not to rush it. The moment you go to authorities prematurely, or the moment Dan senses pressure building, he has every incentive to destroy evidence, drain further assets, or simply disappear with what he's already taken. We move when the case is airtight, not a day before. I understood that. I hated it, some days, the sheer discipline required to sit across the breakfast table from a man I now knew, with total certainty, had built an entire second life on my money and my blindness, and to say nothing, to pass him the coffee, to ask how his day was. But every time the anger rose up hot enough to want to burn the whole thing down early, I thought about my father's voice telling me that kindness needs offense, and I thought, grimly, that the same principle applied here. Rage needs offense too. Otherwise, it just burns down your own house, along with everyone else's. One evening, Dan came home unusually early, which by itself was enough to put me on alert. He poured 2 glasses of wine, unprompted, and sat across from me at the kitchen island with an expression I hadn't seen from him in a long time, something almost like real vulnerability. "Nora, can we talk? Really talk for once." I kept my voice even. "Sure." He turned his glass slowly by the stem. I know I haven't been present. The launch has eaten me alive, and I know that's not an excuse. But I've been thinking, once Meridian ships, maybe we take some time, a real vacation, figure some things out. I studied him across the counter. This man performing an apology for a marriage he'd already legally ended without telling me, offering me a vacation to smooth over a betrayal he assumed I still knew nothing about. There was a version of me, the version from a year earlier, that might have reached across the counter and taken his hand right then, relieved beyond words that he was finally trying. That version of me was gone. In her place sat someone who simply nodded and said, "That sounds nice. Let's get through the launch first." He seemed satisfied with that, relieved even, like he'd cleared some private hurdle in his own head. I finished my wine, thanked him for dinner, and went to bed early, lying awake a long time afterward listening to him move around the apartment, wondering how a person could sound so at ease with himself while standing on top of everything he'd buried. Ray's audit turned up something I hadn't expected. Buried in the approval chain for 3 of the largest fraudulent vendor contracts wasn't just Dan's signature. It was a second one, our VP of Business Development, Ethan Cole, a smooth, well-liked guy who'd been with the company for 4 years and who I'd personally promoted 18 months earlier. Priya found it first, cross-referencing purchase order approvals against Ethan's calendar. He signed off on 2 of the Vanguard Tech invoices while he was supposedly out of the country at a conference in Austin. Either somebody used his login without him knowing, or he was never actually the one traveling that week. I sat with that for a long moment. Ethan had a wife and a toddler at home. He'd cried, actual tears, at his own promotion dinner, thanking me for believing in him when nobody else had given him a shot after he'd been laid off from his last job. I didn't want it to be him, but I'd learned enough in the last 2 months to know that wanting something not to be true had never once made it not true. I had Tom quietly pull Ethan's financials discreetly through public records and a source at his bank who owed Tom a favor from years back. What came back wasn't complicated. Ethan had a gambling problem he'd been hiding from his wife for over a year, and Dan had apparently been covering select losses in exchange for his signature on paperwork. Ethan never looked at too closely. It wasn't loyalty. It wasn't even real complicity, not in the way Dan's was. It was a drowning man taking whatever rope got thrown to him, without asking too many questions about who was holding the other end or what they wanted in return. I didn't confront Ethan directly. Not yet. Diane advised against it, sharply. If you tip him off, he panics and either destroys records or runs straight to Dan for cover. Let him keep believing nobody's looking. We use his signature as evidence, not as a conversation starter. It was a cold, practical piece of advice, and I hated how easily I was learning to take it. There was a version of me, not that long ago, who would have marched into Ethan's office and asked him, with real hurt in my voice, how he could do this to people who'd genuinely tried to help him. That version of me had gotten quieter and quieter over the past 2 months, replaced by someone who understood that hurt feelings didn't win lawsuits, and that the fastest way to lose everything was to let anger set the schedule instead of evidence. Meanwhile, Tom's surveillance on Jake Dunlap sharpened into something that could no longer be dismissed as background noise. He'd started showing up at Tessa's building in the middle of the day, not just evenings. And one afternoon, Tom got close enough with a directional mic to catch part of an argument through a cracked stairwell door. Jake's voice, low and mean. "You think I forgot what you told me that night in Ohio? You think Dan's little dinosaur-loving kid is gonna save you if I decide to make a call?" Tessa's voice, shaking, begging him to lower his voice, promising him money, more time, anything. Tom relayed it to me flat, professional, no editorializing, but I could hear something tighten in his voice anyway. "Nora, whatever Jake knows, it sounds bigger than an affair. Sounds like it might be about the kid specifically. I sat with that a long time after we hung up. I had my own suspicions forming, quiet ones I hadn't said out loud to anyone yet, not even Diane. If Jake Dunlap knew something about Eli that even Tessa was terrified of him repeating, there was really only one kind of secret that fit that shape. I didn't chase that thread directly. I didn't need to. I'd learned by then that some doors open themselves eventually, on their own schedule, if you're patient enough to wait outside them instead of kicking them down early. What I needed to do instead was keep tightening the net around the money, because the money was the part I could prove in a courtroom without anyone's testimony, without anyone's confession, without anyone's cooperation at all. Numbers don't lie for anybody. People do, constantly. But a wire transfer records itself in the same cold, indifferent language, no matter who's trying to hide behind it. 3 weeks before the Meridian launch, Ray finished the infrastructure work. He came to my office late on a Thursday, laptop under his arm, and walked me through it in plain language. Every administrative credential Dan had once held alone was now split across a compartmentalized structure, 3 separate keys required for any system-wide override, one of which sat with Ray's own encrypted service, entirely outside Dan's reach. The legacy master override, the one Dan had used for years without oversight, still existed on paper, still looked functional from the inside, but had been quietly rerouted to trigger an immediate access revocation and full logging event the moment anyone tried to use it. If he ever tries to pull that lever, Ray said, it's going to look from his end exactly like it always has. From our end, it's going to lock him out completely and hand us a time-stamped record of the attempt. He won't know the difference until it's too late to matter. I asked him if there was any risk Dan would notice the change before then. Ray shook his head. Not unless he goes looking for it specifically, and there's no reason for him to. To him, everything still works exactly the way it always has. That's the whole point. I thanked him, and meant it more than the words probably conveyed. For 2 months, I'd been carrying a low, constant fear that the entire company, the thing my father had believed in enough to leave me $35 million worth of separate, protected assets, partly so I'd never have to depend on anyone else's goodwill again, could be taken hostage by one man's temper the second he realized he'd lost. Ray had just quietly removed that particular fear from the table. Whatever happened next, however Dan reacted when the truth finally surfaced in front of everyone, he was no longer holding a gun to the thing I'd built with my own hands. That same week, Diane finalized the legal packet. Fraudulent divorce filing, forged power of attorney routing, over $800,000 in traceable embezzlement, corporate sabotage risk documented through Ray's audit, and a growing paper trail connecting Dan, Tessa, Carol, and Ethan through financial records that didn't require anyone's testimony to hold up. We're close, Diane told me, sliding the folder across her desk. Close enough that I want to start quiet conversations with the DA's Financial Crimes Unit, off the record, before we move publicly. Once we file, there's no controlling the timeline anymore. I want the pieces already in motion before that happens. I asked her when. She looked at me for a long moment. You have a launch event in 3 weeks with every major investor and half the tech press in this city sitting in one room. If I were building the timeline myself, I'd want it to break there, in public, where he can't spin it, can't quietly settle it, can't threaten anyone into silence afterward. I sat with that. 3 weeks. 3 weeks of Sunday dinners at Patricia's, 3 weeks of passing Dan the coffee in the morning, 3 weeks of pretending I still believed every word out of his mouth, while underneath all of it, a very different kind of machinery had already started turning. The week before the launch, I almost lost the whole careful architecture of my own composure. I was in my office late, reviewing final slides for the Meridian keynote, when Dan walked in without knocking, the way he always used to before things went cold between us. He set a coffee down on my desk, unprompted. Black. Exactly how I liked it. A small gesture that would have meant something once. "You've seemed lighter this week," he said, leaning against the doorframe. "I mean that as a compliment. It's good to see." I kept my eyes on the slide deck. Launch week does that. Adrenaline mostly. He studied me a beat too long for comfort. "Sometimes I forget how good you are under pressure. You always land on your feet." I looked up at him then, just for a second, long enough to let something almost slip out from behind my eyes, some flicker of everything I now knew sitting right there at the surface. I caught it before it fully showed and turned it into a tired smile instead. "I've had a lot of practice lately." He didn't catch the second meaning. Or if he did, he filed it away as something else entirely. The ordinary exhaustion of a woman running a company through grief and a fertility struggle he still believed was the biggest wound in our marriage. He left a few minutes later, and I sat there afterward with my hands pressed flat against the desk, breathing slowly, reminding myself of exactly how many days were left and exactly how much was riding on my ability to keep this particular door shut for just a little longer. Priya finished her final audit that same week, the number settling at just over $840,000 in confirmed fraudulent transfers, once every last shell vendor had been traced and every duplicate invoice cross-checked against actual deliverables. Diane had her legal packet complete and quietly pre-filed with the DA's Financial Crimes Division, structured so that a public disclosure could trigger formal charges within hours rather than weeks. Ray's security architecture had been live and tested for nearly a month. Every attempted use of any legacy credential logged automatically to a server Dan had no access to and no reason to suspect existed. Tom had continued watching Tessa's building at a distance, and 2 days before the launch he called with something new, urgency in his voice for the first time since I'd hired him. "Jake Dunlap filed something. Small claims paperwork. Doesn't look like much on its face, but attached to it is a copy of a paternity test. He's using it as leverage, threatening to make it public unless Tessa pays him what he says she owes him. I got a partial copy through the county clerk's office. Nora, the test isn't matching Dan as the father." I sat very still holding the phone. Somewhere underneath all the anger of the last 2 months, a small, quiet part of me had wondered, hoped almost, whether some piece of what Dan believed about that little boy was real, whether at least his devotion to Eli, however it had come about, was genuine, and not one more layer of the same rot. Now even that small mercy was gone. Dan hadn't just built a second family on stolen money, he'd built it on a lie even Tessa had been keeping from him. I asked Tom whether Dan knew any of this. "No indication he does. Whatever Jake's holding, he's been squeezing Tessa specifically, not Dan." I thanked him and hung up, sitting a long time in the quiet of my own office, turning the information over without deciding, yet, what to do with it. Diane, when I told her, was characteristically going on with you and Dan lately. I've noticed it too. I hope whatever it is, you two find your way back to each other. I sat with the phone against my ear a long moment, genuinely unsure, for the first time in months, what to say to her. Whatever cruelty she'd dealt me over the years, some of it clearly came from a real place. A mother's blind, uncomplicated hope that her son's marriage would hold. She had no idea what was coming, no idea that in less than 48 hours, the ground under her entire family was going to open up in front of a room full of strangers. I told her gently that I appreciated her calling, and that whatever happened, I hoped she'd remember that I never stopped trying. It was true, and it was also the last kind thing I intended to say to that family before everything changed. The morning of the launch, I woke up before my alarm, the way you do before something enormous, lying in the dark next to a man who still had no idea his entire constructed life was hours from collapsing in front of an audience. I got up quietly, showered, and stood in front of the mirror a long time afterward, looking at a woman I barely recognized from 2 months earlier. Not because I looked different on the outside, because something underneath had gone from soft to load-bearing, the way a bridge cable does under enough sustained pressure. I thought about my father, about the fence he'd always talked about, kindness needing a fence around it or it turns into a doormat. I thought about how long it had taken me to build that fence myself, brick by brick, in total silence, while still setting the table every night for a man who'd already left. Today, I thought, standing there in the gray morning light, the fence finally goes up in front of everyone else too. Not just in front of him. In front of anyone who ever thought my kindness came without a limit. By 6 that evening, the atrium of the Fulton Market venue we'd rented for the Meridian launch was already lit up, staff running last checks on the sound system and the massive screen mounted behind the stage. The lakeside analytics backdrop looked flawless, sleek navy and silver, like nothing behind it could possibly be on the verge of falling apart. I wore a sharp white suit, hair pulled back, and stood in the wings looking out at the auditorium filling with investors, major clients, and half a dozen tech reporters occupying the front 2 rows with their laptops already open. I took one long breath. For weeks I hadn't been afraid of the pain anymore. The only thing I feared, standing there, was watching this company die unfairly because of one man's greed, after everything my father and my team had put into building it. Ray found me backstage a few minutes before we went live, speaking low. Every legacy credential is locked. All logging is active and stable. I nodded. Thank you, Ray. He held my eyes a second longer than usual. Today's the day you take back what's yours. I walked out onto the stage to polite, expectant applause. The lights were blinding and hot, but my mind, for the first time in months, felt completely still. I opened with the origin story, the leaky sublet, the space heater, the 6 of us who believed in something nobody else did yet. I talked about the team, about the early clients who took a chance on us before we had a track record to point to, about my father, who taught me that business has to be run clean and that kindness has to travel alongside real vigilance, never apart from it. I didn't mention Dan once. Because of that omission, when he walked into the auditorium partway through with Tessa and Patricia trailing behind him, he looked visibly, openly irritated. Tessa wore a cream-colored dress, carrying Eli on her hip. Patricia walked beside them looking almost regal, like she'd come to watch her son crowned. After the introduction, we moved into the live product demonstration. On the massive screen behind me, the Meridian platform spun up exactly the way it was supposed to. Investors leaned forward, watching intently. My heart was hammering underneath the calm surface I'd been holding all day, but my eyes never left that screen. And that's when Dan stood up. He marched down the center aisle toward the stage and pulled the microphone straight out of the MC's hand before anyone could stop him. His voice cracked out across the sound system, echoing off the high ceiling. I have to object to this launch proceeding. There's a critical security vulnerability in this system, and as CTO, I'm the only one with clearance to run an emergency diagnostic right now. The room erupted into murmurs. Investors exchanged panicked, uncertain glances. A few of the reporters in the front row already had their phones up recording. I stood completely still on that stage. Even now, even with everything already stacked against him, Dan was choosing to burn down the thing he'd helped build with his own hands, rather than let me have this moment cleanly. When a person loses their sense of shame entirely, they stop fearing how anything looks in front of other people. Dan strode to the technical desk at the side of the stage, opened his laptop, plugged in a security key, and started typing rapidly, jaw set, eyes locked on the screen. I knew exactly what he thought he was triggering. The override he'd built years ago and never once imagined anyone would think to take away from him. The whole room seemed to hold its breath together. 1 second. 5. 10. The system didn't crash. Instead, a clean, unmistakable message flashed up on the giant screen behind me for the entire auditorium to read. Unauthorized access attempt. Credentials revoked. Dan's face went completely white. He typed faster, hit the keys harder, like sheer force might make the machine remember who used to be in charge of it. Same result, every time. That's when Ray stepped out from backstage, microphone in hand, his voice calm, carrying, professional in a way that somehow made the whole scene even more damning. My name is Ray Ortiz, independent cybersecurity consultant retained by Lakeside Analytics. Under legal authorization from the CEO, we completed a full overhaul of the company's administrative access protocols several weeks ago, isolated the legacy emergency override, and logged every unauthorized access attempt against it since. All previous standalone administrative credentials have been permanently revoked. A gasp moved through the auditorium like a wave. I looked over and saw Dan frozen under the spotlight, standing exactly where he'd walked, holding a laptop that no longer opened anything at all. What he'd believed was his master key had just opened, in front of a room full of investors and reporters. Absolutely nothing. I stepped forward and reclaimed the microphone from the stunned MC. In the interest of full transparency with our partners and investors, I have one more announcement to make tonight. The massive screen behind me switched over to an independent audit summary. Financial trails appeared in clean, unambiguous lines: fabricated vendor contracts, Marsh Technical Supply, ghost vendors with no offices, no staff, no actual product ever delivered. Money routed in careful, deliberate circles, designed to look like nothing at all if you didn't know exactly where to look. The final figure appeared on the screen like a gavel coming down. $841,000. I spoke slowly, letting every word land. This is the total confirmed amount of anomalous capital siphoned out of this company over the past 2.5 years, traced directly to internal personnel and their relatives. Diane stepped up to the podium beside me to deliver the formal legal statement, her voice steady and unhurried, the voice of someone who'd been waiting a long time to say this out loud in public. Lakeside Analytics has forwarded a comprehensive evidentiary package to both federal and state authorities regarding suspected embezzlement, corporate sabotage, wire fraud, and a fraudulently executed marital dissolution. All involved parties will be pursued to the fullest extent the law allows. Out in the audience, Ethan Cole went visibly pale and tried to slip toward a side exit, only to find corporate security and a pair of legal representatives already positioned there, quietly asking him to remain in the room. Near the back doors, Carol Marsh attempted to slip out unnoticed, only to find Tom Reyes waiting there, standing beside two plainclothes officers who'd been briefed to expect exactly this. Tessa, still holding Eli, spun around in a panic, looking for any way out of the room that didn't exist. And that's when a man shoved his way through the crowd near the back, loud enough that half the room turned toward him instead of the stage. It was Jake Dunlap. He wore a smirk that didn't belong anywhere near the tragedy unfolding around him. "Running already, Tessa? You still haven't paid me what you owe me." Both Tessa and Dan turned toward him at the same instant. Dan, still frozen at the tech desk, grabbed the manila folder out of a startled legal assistant's hands nearby and flipped frantically through the last few pages, as if speed alone could rewrite whatever he was about to read. I hadn't planned on the paternity issue coming out in that room. I hadn't intended to say a word about it publicly. But in his panic, Dan read the paternity test results and a printed thread of text messages between Tessa and Jake out loud, right there in front of investors, reporters, and his own mother, his voice climbing toward something raw and unrecognizable. No, this can't be right. His hands were shaking. The kid. He's not even mine. Tessa broke down into hysterical, gasping sobs, sinking into the nearest chair with Eli still clutched against her chest. Patricia rose halfway out of her seat, gripping the back of the chair in front of her like she might collapse without it. Daniel, what on earth are you saying? Nobody could answer her. The truth had already laid itself bare in front of a room full of strangers with their phones still recording. Every ounce of moral superiority that family had used against me for years, all of it dressed up as concern, as tough love, as tradition, turned out to be nothing more than performance, wrapped around a lie that had just come apart in real time. Patricia sank back into her seat like something inside her had simply given out. Dan looked, standing there under those stage lights, like a man who'd already died and hadn't been told yet. I looked over at Eli, terrified, burying his face in his mother's shoulder, and felt something in my chest sink even through all of it. The adults in that room had lost, every single one of them, through their own choices. But that little boy hadn't chosen any of it, and he was the one being dragged through the wreckage in front of a room full of cameras. The launch event ended in something close to open shock, and yet, absurdly, the product itself ran flawlessly through the rest of the demo, exactly as Ray's team had built it to. Investors stayed behind afterward to speak with me privately, one by one, several of them telling me quietly that they respected how I'd handled it more than they could say. Employees I passed in the hallway looked at me with an entirely different expression than I'd seen from them in months. Not confusion anymore, but something closer to relief. Like people finally allowed to exhale after holding their breath without knowing why. I thought, walking off that stage, that it was over. It wasn't. That night, once the last of the caterers and stage crew had cleared out, I walked down to the venue's underground parking level alone, keys in hand, replaying the whole evening in my head, still not fully able to believe it had actually happened the way it happened. Tom had insisted on walking me out earlier, but I'd told him I needed 5 minutes by myself first, just to breathe. I regretted that decision almost immediately. I heard Tom's voice before I saw him, sharp and urgent, echoing off the concrete. Nora, watch out. Dan lunged out from behind a support pillar near my car, and for one disorienting second my brain simply refused to process what I was looking at. In one hand he held an external hard drive. In the other, a folding knife caught the fluorescent light, blade already open. His face had gone gray and slick with sweat, eyes bloodshot, nothing left in them of the man who'd once put a hand on my shoulder at my own father's funeral and told me I still had him. "Drop the charges," he snarled, voice cracking halfway through the sentence. "Drop the lawsuit, or I swear to God, Nora." I stood my ground, my back against the cold hood of my own car, hands trembling but planted. In 9 years as his wife, I never once imagined this particular man looking at me like I was an enemy he genuinely wanted to hurt. But within seconds, Tom and 2 plainclothes officers who'd been quietly stationed at the venue all evening tackled Dan straight to the concrete. The hard drive clattered out of his hand and skidded to a stop right at the toe of my shoe. A fake ID and the knife fell out of his jacket pocket as the officers pinned him down. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs locking into place echoed through that empty garage, a short, small sound that somehow managed to end 9 years of a marriage in about half a second. I stood there a long time after they hauled him up, not moving, staring down at the hard drive lying near my shoe like it belonged to somebody else's story entirely. Tom crouched beside me. "You all right?" I nodded, though I wasn't sure it was true yet. "What was on the drive?" One of the officers picked it up carefully with a gloved hand, already bagging it as evidence. "We'll know soon enough. Given everything else tonight, I wouldn't bet on it being anything good for him." They walked Dan toward a waiting patrol car, and as they passed me, he turned his head and looked at me one last time, something desperate and pleading flickering across his face, like he genuinely believed there was still a version of tonight where I softened. I didn't say anything. There wasn't anything left worth saying to him in a parking garage at 11 at night. Not after everything that had already been said, on my behalf, in front of a room full of strangers, an hour earlier. I watched the patrol car pull out of the garage and disappear up the ramp, and only then did my knees finally decide to remember how frightening the last 10 minutes had actually been. Tom caught my elbow before I fully understood I was swaying. "Easy. Sit down a second." I sat on the low concrete curb beside my car, put my head down, and for the first time in 2 months, allowed myself to shake, quietly, entirely, without an audience. The next morning, the story was everywhere before I'd even finished my first cup of coffee. A local tech reporter who'd been sitting in the front row had posted a clip of Dan grabbing the microphone within an hour of the event ending, and by sunrise it had migrated well past the local business press into national coverage, the kind of headline that writes itself. Disgraced tech CTO attempts sabotage at own company's product launch. Arrested hours later on weapons and fraud charges. My phone didn't stop buzzing for 2 days straight. Reporters, former colleagues, distant relatives I hadn't spoken to in a decade, all wanting some piece of a story that had, until 48 hours earlier, belonged only to the small circle of people who already knew every detail of it firsthand. I let Diane handle most of the outside inquiries, releasing a single, carefully worded statement on behalf of Lakeside Analytics that confirmed the company had cooperated fully with authorities and had already implemented enhanced financial and security controls, without wading any further into the personal wreckage than the fact strictly required. Inside the company itself, the mood shifted in a way I hadn't fully braced for. I'd expected shock. I'd expected some employees to feel embarrassed on my behalf, or awkward around me, the way people sometimes are around a person who's just survived something public and humiliating. Instead, over the following week, a slow, steady stream of people stopped by my office, mostly just to say some version of the same thing. Priya told me the whole finance team had known, in the vague, half-formed way people sense wrongness long before they can prove it, that something had been off about certain vendor contracts for over a year, and that nobody had felt senior enough or safe enough to push back on Dan directly. An engineer named Marcus, who'd worked under Dan for 3 years, admitted quietly that he'd flagged an odd access pattern on the admin credentials 8 months earlier and been told, politely but firmly, to mind his own lane. Hearing that stung in a new way. It meant the rot hadn't just been hidden from me specifically. It had been sitting in plain sight for people with less power than I had. People who hadn't felt they had the standing to say anything about it out loud. I made a note, sitting with that discomfort, that whatever came next for this company had to include building something safer for the people at every level of it, not just at the top. Patricia called me 4 days after the launch. I almost didn't pick up. When I finally did, her voice sounded smaller than I'd ever heard it, all the certainty scraped off of it. "Nora, I owe you an apology I don't know how to give properly. I spent years telling you what you owed this family, and it turns out my own son was the one who owed everybody something, and he never planned on paying it." I didn't say anything cruel to her, though I could have. I told her, honestly, that I appreciated her calling, and that whatever happened with Dan legally was between him and the courts now, not between her and me. "What about the boy?" she asked, quieter still. "Eli. Is anyone looking after that child properly in all this?" I told her the truth, that Child Protective Services and family court would be involved regardless of anyone's personal feelings, and that Tessa, whatever she'd done, was still that child's mother, and would need to answer for her own choices separately from whatever happened to Dan. Patricia was quiet a long moment on the other end of the line. I always wanted a grandchild so badly I never once stopped to ask what kind of family I was actually building for one to be born into. I didn't have a comforting answer for that. I'm not sure one exists. The investigation that followed took the better part of 8 months, longer than I expected. Though Diane assured me repeatedly that this was actually fast for a case with this many moving parts. Federal prosecutors picked up the wire fraud and interstate financial elements, while Cook County handled the fraudulent divorce filing and the weapons charge from the parking garage. Dan was formally indicted on counts of embezzlement, extortion, corporate sabotage, wire fraud, and falsifying legal documents, a list long enough that even his own defense attorney reportedly advised him early on to consider a plea deal rather than risk a jury hearing the full scope of it laid out in order. He held out for months anyway, apparently still convinced some version of events existed where a jury would see him as a wronged husband rather than a man who'd spent 2.5 years quietly stealing from his own company to fund a second household built on a lie he hadn't even known was a lie yet. Tessa's case moved differently. Her attorney argued, not unreasonably, that she'd been drawn into the fraud gradually, first through Dan's money and later through genuine fear of Jake Dunlap, who by then faced his own separate charges for extortion once his paternity test blackmail scheme came fully to light. Tessa ultimately pled guilty to a reduced fraud charge in exchange for cooperating fully with prosecutors against both Dan and her own mother, testimony that ended up mattering a great deal, since Carol Marsh's shell vendor accounts form the backbone of the largest fraud counts against Dan. Carol was convicted on facilitation and money laundering charges tied directly to the vendor scheme. The same woman who'd once knelt in front of my father in a Kentucky hollow, swearing she'd do anything to protect her daughter from a bad marriage, now facing prison time for helping engineer a different kind of harm entirely, on a much larger scale, against a family that had once tried to help hers. Ethan Cole's situation resolved the most quietly of all of them. His cooperation with prosecutors, combined with the genuinely coercive circumstances Tom had uncovered around his gambling debts, kept him out of prison, though his career in the tech industry was effectively finished the moment his name appeared in any of the court filings. I ran into him once, months later, at a coffee shop near the old office, and he looked smaller than I remembered. Older, the easy charm gone out of him entirely. He apologized to me directly, unprompted, and I told him I believed he was sorry, which was true, and that being sorry didn't undo what his signature had helped cause, which was also true. I didn't feel triumphant saying it. Mostly I just felt tired, the particular exhaustion that comes from watching an entire ecosystem of small compromises finally collapse under its own weight, taking down people who'd started out, most of them, as something other than villains. Jake Dunlap received the least sympathy from anyone involved, myself included, given that his own extortion attempt against Tessa had nothing charitable underneath it at all, no fear, no desperation born of poverty, just plain greed looking for a lever to pull. He pled guilty to extortion and served just over 2 years. Patricia was never criminally charged, having had no actual knowledge of the fraud, but the collapse cost her something no court could have levied against her anyway, the particular pride she'd built her whole identity around for decades, the pride of a mother whose son had done everything right. Watching that pride dissolve in real time over a single evening in a rented event space was its own kind of sentence, one she'd likely be serving quietly for the rest of her life. Dan, in the end, took a plea agreement rather than risk trial, pleading guilty to the embezzlement and wire fraud counts in exchange for the state dropping the standalone weapons charge into a combined sentencing recommendation. He received 7 years, with the possibility of parole after 4, a number that felt, on the day the judge read it out loud, almost beside the point. I sat in the back of that courtroom, not because I needed to see him sentenced to feel some sense of closure, but because Diane had suggested, gently, that it might help me stop carrying the story around as an open question in my head. She was right, mostly. Watching him stand there in a state-issued jumpsuit, smaller somehow than he'd ever looked in 9 years of marriage, didn't feel like victory. It felt like the closing of a very long, very expensive door. The months right after the launch were strange in a way nobody warns you about. Everyone around me kept asking if I was okay in the tone people use for someone who's just survived a car accident, and I kept saying yes, mostly because the honest answer was too complicated to explain in a hallway between meetings. I wasn't devastated the way I expected to be. I'd already done most of my grieving in private, over 2 months of evidence folders and cold coffee, long before the rest of the world found out there was anything to grieve. What I felt instead, in the weeks after, was something closer to disorientation. The strange vertigo of a person who'd spent 9 years building her entire identity around being one half of something. Waking up to discover she'd actually been standing alone for a lot longer than she realized, and hadn't fallen over. I moved out of the apartment within 3 weeks, into a smaller place near the river with fewer rooms and better light, and I remember standing in the empty new apartment on the first night with a mattress on the floor and nothing on the walls yet, feeling something unexpected settle into my chest. Not happiness exactly. Something quieter than that. Room. I hadn't realized how much of myself I'd been rationing for years, how carefully I'd learned to take up less space in my own home so as not to disturb whatever Dan was carrying around in his head. Standing in that bare apartment, I let out a breath I think I'd been holding, in some form, since roughly the year Eli was conceived. My mother, who lived outside the city and had never fully warmed to Dan even in the early years, drove in the weekend after the launch and sat with me at my kitchen counter while I ate real food for what felt like the first time in months. She didn't say I told you so, though she'd have had every right to. She just held my hand across the counter and said, "Your father would be furious he wasn't here to see this play out himself. He'd have wanted to be in that room." I laughed, the first real laugh in a long time, picturing my dad's face if he'd been sitting in that audience watching the whole thing unfold, the quiet, satisfied nod he probably would have given at exactly the moment that override failed on the screen. "He basically was there, Mom," I told her. "Every piece of it ran through decisions he taught me how to make." She squeezed my hand and didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. I went back to therapy that fall, something I'd let lapse during the worst stretch of the fertility treatments years earlier, when it had started to feel like one more appointment demanding proof that I was trying hard enough. My therapist, a calm, unflappable woman named Dr. Alvarez, who'd clearly seen a wide range of things walk through her office door over the years, listened to the entire unabridged version of the last 2 months without visibly blinking once, and then asked me a question that stuck with me longer than almost anything else anyone said that whole year. "Nora, when you found out about the divorce, you didn't fall apart. You built a case. I'm curious what that tells you about yourself." I sat with that a long time before answering. It tells me I trust evidence more than I trust feelings, maybe. It tells me I'd rather be right and prepared than be comforted. She nodded slowly. "That served you extraordinarily well in this specific crisis. I'd just gently ask you to notice, going forward, whether it's the only tool you reach for when something hurts. Not every wound needs a spreadsheet. Some of them just need you to sit still long enough to actually feel them." I didn't have a clean answer for her that day. I'm still working on one, honestly, more than a year later. I saw Tessa exactly once more after the plea deal was finalized, entirely by accident, in the parking lot of a family court building where I'd gone to give a deposition related to the corporate side of the case, and she'd gone, presumably, for something related to Eli's custody arrangement. She looked thinner than even the photos Tom had taken of her outside that Riverview building, all the polish gone out of her, back to something closer to the frightened girl who'd once grabbed both my hands in a Kentucky Hollow and told me she just wanted to support herself. She saw me across the lot and froze, clearly unsure whether to approach or run. I walked over instead, mostly because I realized, standing there, that I actually wanted to say something to her directly, one last time, without a lawyer standing between us. "How's Eli doing?" I asked her, and I meant it plainly, without any hidden edge underneath the question. She looked surprised I'd asked. "He asks about his dad sometimes. I don't know what to tell him yet." I nodded. "You'll figure out an age-appropriate version eventually. Kids are more resilient than we give them credit for, as long as somebody's honest with them eventually." She looked down at the pavement a long moment. "I used to think you saved my life, back when I was 22. I don't know how to hold both things at once now, that you did save me, and that I helped take apart everything you built." I didn't have a tidy answer for her either. "You don't have to hold both things at once today," I told her. "Just try to build something honest with what's left. That's really all any of us get to do at this point." I left it there, walked to my car, and didn't look back to see her reaction. Some conversations don't need a bow tied on them. They just need to end somewhere true. Lakeside Analytics, against every reasonable expectation for a company that had just watched its own CTO try to sabotage a product launch on camera, came out the other side of that year stronger than it had gone in. I promoted Ray Ortiz to Chief Technology Officer within a month of the launch, on the theory that a man who'd already spent weeks quietly rebuilding our entire security architecture without anyone noticing was exactly the kind of person who should be permanently in charge of making sure nothing like this ever happened again. Ray restructured the entire engineering leadership team around a principle he insisted on from day one. No single person, himself included, would ever again hold unilateral administrative control over any critical system. Every override required at least 2 authorized approvals from separate departments. Every access change generated an automatic audit log visible to a standing internal oversight committee, and every vendor contract over a modest threshold required competitive bids and documented deliverables before a single dollar moved. It made some things slower. It made almost everything safer. I decided I could live with that trade. The Meridian platform itself, once the initial shock of the launch night wore off, actually performed better in the market than we'd projected before any of the scandal broke. Several investors told me afterward, with a kind of dry amusement I hadn't expected, that watching me handle a public sabotage attempt with that level of composure had done more to earn their long-term confidence than any polished keynote ever could have. One venture partner put it to me over lunch a few months later. "Anybody can look good when nothing's going wrong. We invest in people who don't fall apart when everything does." I thought about my father saying almost the same thing to me once, years earlier, about judging character past whatever a person says when things are calm. It turned out the lesson applied just as well to boardrooms as it did to Kentucky Hollows. We landed 2 major new enterprise contracts within 6 months of the launch, one of them from a logistics firm that had specifically cited our transparent handling of the crisis as a reason they trusted us with their data infrastructure going forward, which was a strange, backwards kind of silver lining I hadn't anticipated, but was grateful for anyway. Priya got promoted to a formal CFO role that spring, a title she'd effectively earned the night she sat across from me at midnight with a spreadsheet of stolen money and refused to let either of us look away from it. She ran finance from then on with a level of scrutiny that occasionally annoyed department heads used to easier approvals, and I told her every time she apologized for it that she should never once soften that instinct on my account. It had already saved the company once. I wasn't interested in gambling that it wouldn't need to again someday. I hired an outside HR consultant that same year to run a full anonymous survey across every department, specifically asking employees whether they'd ever noticed something that felt wrong but hadn't felt safe enough to report it. The results were humbling. Nearly a third of respondents said yes, most of them describing exactly the kind of quiet unease Marcus had described to me about the admin access pattern he'd flagged and been waved off from pursuing. I used those results to build a formal, protected internal reporting channel, run entirely outside the normal management chain, specifically so that the next person who noticed something wrong wouldn't have to weigh their job security against their conscience the way Marcus had. It felt like the smallest possible repayment for what his silence, and Ethan's, and dozens of smaller silences across the company had ultimately cost all of us. It also felt, honestly, like the only kind of repayment that actually mattered. The following spring, I used a portion of my father's inheritance to establish something I'd been quietly designing on paper for months: a legal aid fund specifically for women who'd been defrauded by a spouse through hidden divorces, forged financial documents, or coerced signatures. The exact category of harm that had almost cost me everything before I happened to be sitting across from a notary who noticed a discrepancy on a routine filing. We called it the Hale Legal Aid Initiative, and I structured it deliberately in my father's name rather than my own, since the whole idea had really started with a lesson he'd spent years trying to teach me, long before I understood why it mattered. Diane agreed to chair the advisory board, and within the first year we'd funded free legal representation for over 60 women across Illinois and Indiana, most of them discovering, the same way I had, that a piece of paper signed in exhaustion or grief can quietly detonate years later in a lawyer's office or a courthouse hallway. One of our early clients, a woman named Renata, who'd worked as a dental hygienist outside Rockford, came to us after discovering that her husband had forged her signature on a home equity loan and drained the proceeds into an account she never knew existed, using almost the identical playbook Dan had used against me. A stack of urgent paperwork handed over during a period when she was too exhausted from caring for a sick parent to read every line carefully. Diane's team helped her untangle the fraud within 4 months, recovering enough of the drained equity to keep her house out of foreclosure. Renata called our office afterward, crying, to thank us, and I remember standing in the hallway listening to Diane repeat back to her, almost word for word, the same thing my own father used to say to me. "You don't owe us gratitude. Just keep your eyes open going forward, and if you're ever in a position to help someone else the way we helped you, do it with a clear head and a fence around your kindness." I stood there hearing her say it and felt something settle in my chest that had been unsettled since long before the notary appointment that started all of this. My father's lessons, it turned out, hadn't just protected me. They'd become something bigger than either of us, something that could keep protecting people neither of us would ever personally meet. I visited the clinic's intake office once a month, mostly just to sit in on cases and remind myself why the whole thing existed. And it was there, nearly a year after the launch, that I got the letter from Dan. His attorney had apparently advised against it, according to a brief note Diane passed along after screening it first, but he'd sent it anyway. 6 handwritten pages from a state correctional facility downstate, full of apology, full of explanation, full of the particular kind of self-justification that comes easily to a person who's had a long time in a cell to rehearse it. He wrote that he'd never meant for it to go as far as it did, that Tessa's mother had approached him first with the vendor scheme when Lakeside's early cash flow was tighter than the public story ever let on, that one small compromise had led to another until he genuinely wasn't sure, looking back, exactly which decision had been the one that made turning back impossible. He wrote that he still thought about our early years together, the space heater, the 6 of us crowded into that sublet, and that some part of him had never stopped loving the woman who used to sit across from him running numbers until 2 in the morning. He asked at the end if there was any chance, someday, of forgiveness. I read the whole letter twice, sitting alone in my office with the door closed, and I noticed, reading it, that I felt almost nothing sharp anymore. Not rage, not grief. Just a kind of tired clarity, the way you feel reading an old diary entry from a person you used to be and no longer recognize particularly well. I didn't write him back myself. I had Diane pass along a single message on my behalf, short enough to fit on one line. I no longer hate you. There's no room for you in my life anymore. I meant both halves of that sentence exactly equally, and I think, honestly, that surprised me more than anything else that whole year. I'd expected to still be angry a year out. Instead, I mostly just felt like a woman standing in a different, quieter life, looking back at an old one through glass, the same way I used to look at that wedding photo on the wall before I understood what it had actually documented. Not everything that year was about lawsuits and audits. Some of it was smaller and stranger than that. The kind of thing you don't expect to matter until it quietly does. About 4 months after the launch, a young woman named Grace Okafor joined our design team straight out of a coding boot camp, sharp and eager and constantly apologizing for asking questions she didn't need to apologize for at all. She reminded me, in ways I didn't say out loud to anyone, of a much earlier version of Tessa, the wide-eyed gratitude, the eagerness to prove she belonged in a room she wasn't sure she'd earned a seat at yet. I caught myself watching her a little too closely those first few weeks, half expecting to see some early version of the same warning signs my father had once tried to point out to me in a motel room in Kentucky. What I saw instead, watching her more carefully over time, was mostly just a young woman working hard and asking honest questions, nothing more sinister underneath it than ordinary ambition. It taught me something useful about my own healing, that I needed to learn the difference between vigilance and suspicion, between the fence my father always talked about and a wall built so high it kept out anyone decent along with anyone dangerous. I started mentoring Grace directly that spring, not because she reminded me of anyone in particular, but because she was good at her job and nobody senior had bothered to invest real time in her yet. Within a year, she'd been promoted twice, and I made a point of telling her explicitly, more than once, that she owed me nothing for any of it beyond doing solid work and eventually paying the same kind of attention forward to somebody else down the line. My father's sentence, essentially, handed down a third generation. Eli's situation resolved, over the following 2 years, into something quietly stable. As much as any custody arrangement involving that much public scandal can be called stable. Tessa retained primary custody following her plea agreement, given that her cooperation with prosecutors and the coercive circumstances around Jake Dunlap's blackmail scheme weighed in her favor during sentencing, and family court ultimately structured a support arrangement that didn't involve Dan directly, given his own incarceration and the question still unresolved at the time about paternity. I heard, secondhand, through Diane's occasional updates on the broader case, that Tessa had moved back closer to her mother's side of the family in Indiana once Carol's own sentence concluded, trying to rebuild something quieter for Eli than the life she'd been chasing in that Riverview condo. I thought about reaching out more than once, in the months after that single parking lot conversation, and decided against it every time. Some bridges, once burned all the way down to the pilings, aren't meant to be rebuilt just because enough time has passed to make it feel possible again. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for everyone involved, including yourself, is let a relationship end exactly where it ended, without forcing a reunion neither side actually needs. Patricia and I kept an occasional, careful contact, mostly through short texts around holidays. Nothing warm exactly, but nothing bitter either. She sent a card the following Christmas, a plain one, no long message, just a single line in her looping handwriting. Thinking of you this year, Nora. I hope you're building the life you deserve. I kept that card longer than I expected to, tucked into the same drawer where I kept my father's old business ledgers, two very different kinds of family artifacts sitting side by side, both of them, in their own way, reminders of how complicated it is to actually know the people closest to you. There was one more test that year that I hadn't fully anticipated, and it came, of all places, from a rival firm rather than from anyone directly connected to Dan's mess. A larger competitor out of Austin, sensing an opportunity in the wake of all that public scandal, launched an aggressive campaign to poach 3 of our senior engineers within weeks of the story breaking nationally, offering signing bonuses clearly calibrated to look attractive against the backdrop of a company that had just watched its own CTO try to sabotage its flagship product on stage. For a week or two, I genuinely worried we might lose people we couldn't afford to lose, at exactly the moment we needed stability the most. I called an all-hands meeting instead of letting rumors do the talking for me, and I told the entire company, plainly, everything Diane had cleared me to say publicly about the case, the financial fraud, the security overhaul already completed months before anyone outside the company knew there'd been a threat to address. The new reporting channels built specifically so the next Marcus in this building wouldn't have to choose between his conscience and his paycheck. I told them I understood if some of them felt shaken enough to want to leave, and that I wasn't going to hold it against anyone who did. Then I told them, just as plainly, that I intended to keep building this company on exactly the principles my father had drilled into me since I was old enough to understand a balance sheet, and that anyone who stayed was staying to help build that, not to help me save face. We lost one engineer to the Austin offer. We kept the other 2, and both of them told me afterward, separately, that the all-hands meeting itself was the reason they'd stayed, that watching a leader tell the truth plainly in a room full of people, instead of managing the narrative from a distance through a press release, mattered more to them than a bigger signing bonus ever could. I thought about that a long time afterward, how close I'd come, in the worst months of that whole ordeal, to believing that composure meant silence, that strength meant never letting anyone see the machinery underneath. It turned out the opposite was closer to true. The company held together not because I hid the wound, but because I let people see exactly how it had been treated, stitched, and guarded against happening again. As for my own personal life, in the 2 years since the launch, I've been in no particular hurry to fill the space where a marriage used to sit. I went on a handful of dates that year, mostly at the gentle insistence of my mother and, oddly enough, of Priya, who seemed to have appointed herself an unofficial matchmaker sometime around the same period she became CFO. Nothing serious came of any of it, and I found I wasn't especially bothered by that. For the first time in a long time, my life didn't feel like it was missing a second half. It felt, instead, like something whole on its own, still capable of growing, still capable of eventually making room for someone else if the right person came along, but no longer structured around the assumption that it needed one to be considered complete. My father used to say that a person who can't stand comfortably alone will usually make poor decisions trying to avoid it. I understand that sentence now in a way I didn't at 26, walking down an aisle in a simple white dress, certain that the hand I was holding would never let go of mine. There's a specific kind of quiet I've come to treasure in the years since, one I didn't know how to recognize back when I still had it and didn't understand what it was worth. It's the quiet of an apartment where nobody is performing anything for anybody else, where a plate left half-eaten on the counter means only that I wasn't especially hungry that night, nothing more, nothing hidden underneath it. For a long time after the divorce was finalized, actually finalized, this time with my full knowledge and my own signature affixed on purpose, I kept waiting for that quiet to feel lonely. It never quite did. What it felt like instead, more often than not, was room enough to actually hear my own thoughts again, something I hadn't fully realized I'd lost somewhere in the 9 years of learning to read a room for signs of Dan's mood before I ever got around to checking in on my own. I still run Lakeside Analytics. We crossed 200 employees last spring, still headquartered in that same glass building in Fulton Market, though we've since taken over the floor below ours as well. Ray still runs technology, still insists on his compartmentalized access model even though it occasionally slows down a deployment schedule. Everyone else wishes moved faster. Priya still runs finance with the same unforgiving scrutiny that once sat across a conference table from me at midnight and refused to let either of us look away from a spreadsheet full of stolen money. Diane's firm still chairs the advisory board for my father's clinic, which has now helped close to 200 women across 3 states untangle exactly the kind of fraud that once nearly cost me everything I'd built. I like to think some days that my father would recognize the company we've become more than he'd recognize the company we were the year he died. Back when I still believed a warm dinner could hold a marriage together. Back before I understood that some structures need more than warmth to survive what's coming for them. I testified twice during the various proceedings that followed, once in a deposition for the civil side of the fraud case, and once, more difficult, in the criminal trial against Carol Marsh, since Tessa's cooperation agreement meant she wasn't required to appear in person for that particular hearing. Sitting in the witness box across from a defense attorney whose entire strategy seemed to hinge on portraying me as a wealthy woman who'd simply misplaced some money she wouldn't miss anyway, I understood for the first time how easily a courtroom can flatten an entire year of your life into a series of yes or no questions designed to make your pain sound smaller than it was. Ms. Hale, isn't it true that Lakeside Analytics remained profitable throughout the period in question? Yes. And isn't it true that you yourself recently inherited $35 million? Yes. So this $841,000, while certainly not nothing, represents a relatively small fraction of your overall financial position? I held his gaze a beat longer than he expected. It represents money that 140 employees earned through years of honest work, and that my father earned through 30 years of honest business, funneled without their knowledge or consent into a household built on a fraudulent divorce filing and a lie about a child's paternity. The dollar amount isn't really the injury, counselor. The betrayal is. The judge didn't strike the comment, and I saw 2 jurors nod almost imperceptibly. Diane told me afterward, walking out of the courthouse, that it was the single most useful sentence I'd said in either proceeding. Juries don't convict over spreadsheets, she said. They convict over exactly what you just described. Make sure you say some version of that again if you're ever back up there. I was back up there, as it turned out, for a shorter appearance during Dan's own sentencing hearing, not as a witness exactly, since he'd already pled guilty, but as the victim entitled to make a statement before the judge handed down the number. I hadn't planned to speak at length. I'd written maybe 4 sentences on an index card the night before, mostly out of habit, the same instinct that had made me build spreadsheets instead of screaming 2 years earlier. Standing at the podium, though, looking at Dan seated at the defense table in a state-issued jumpsuit, thinner than I remembered, avoiding my eyes entirely, I set the card down and spoke without it. I told the courtroom about the leaky sublet, the space heater, the 6 of us who'd built something out of nothing because we believed in it more than we believed in our own exhaustion. I told them that the man sitting at that table had once been the person I trusted more than anyone alive outside my own father, and that watching him quietly convert that trust into a weapon over 2.5 years had taught me more about the actual architecture of betrayal than any business school case study ever could. I told them I wasn't asking for the maximum sentence out of vengeance. I was asking for accountability proportional to the damage, the same standard my own company now applied internally to every dollar that moved through it. Then I sat back down, and the judge, reading from her own notes a few minutes later, handed down 7 years. I didn't feel triumphant hearing it. I felt mostly like a chapter had finally been allowed to end on its own terms, instead of continuing to bleed quietly into every other chapter of my life, the way it had for the 2 years before that morning at the Notary. Sometimes, in the quiet stretches after everything settled, I found myself cataloging all the small warning signs I'd waved away over the years. The way you replay a car accident afterward and notice every intersection where a different choice might have avoided it entirely. There was the year Dan started keeping his phone face down on every surface, a habit he explained once, easily, as a distraction reduction technique he'd read about in some productivity newsletter. There was the stretch of months where he suddenly cared, for the first time in our marriage, about redecorating a spare bedroom into a proper home office, insisting on doing the shopping for it himself, on his own schedule, without me ever seeing a single receipt. There was the specific week he started working out again after years of not bothering, buying new clothes that fit better, a haircut he'd never previously cared enough to schedule regularly. None of it, on its own, would have registered as suspicious to anyone. Taken together, laid end to end the way I eventually laid them out in a folder for Diane, they formed a picture so obvious in hindsight that it was almost embarrassing to admit I'd missed it in real time. I don't say that to blame myself. Not anymore. Though I spent a good chunk of that first year doing exactly that in the privacy of my own head, replaying every dinner where I'd chosen not to ask a harder question, every late night I'd chosen to believe a server crash over my own gut. Dr. Alvarez pushed back on that instinct hard more than once. The person who built the deception is responsible for the deception, she told me flatly, during one of our sessions that winter. You weren't naive, Nora. You were married to someone who invested real time and real planning into making sure you wouldn't see it. That's not the same thing as being foolish. That's the difference between a person who trusted reasonably and a person who exploited that trust deliberately. I've come to believe she was right about that, though it took longer to feel true in my body than it did to understand it intellectually. There's a particular kind of grief specific to realizing you weren't just unlucky, that somebody spent years engineering your blind spot on purpose, and it takes real time to stop quietly auditing your own judgment for the crime of having once loved someone who didn't deserve it. What I try to tell women who come through the clinic now, the ones sitting in that same specific kind of shock I remember from the notary's office, is that the signs are almost always there in hindsight, and hindsight is a luxury none of us get to spend in advance. The actual skill worth building isn't perfect suspicion of everyone you love. It's structural protection that holds up regardless of how well you happen to read a given person in a given year. Separate financial accounts that stay separate even in a happy marriage, not as an insult to trust, but as ordinary financial hygiene. The same way you'd wear a seatbelt in a car, you trust yourself to drive carefully. A habit of actually reading documents before signing them, however inconvenient that feels in the moment. However much it seems to imply distrust of a partner who's never given you a reason to distrust him yet. A separate attorney of your own, entirely apart from any joint family counsel, someone whose only job is protecting your individual interests. None of that requires believing your marriage will fail. It simply requires accepting that you can't fully verify, from inside a marriage, exactly what another person is capable of under enough pressure, and building your life in a way that survives being wrong about that, just in case. If there's one thing I didn't expect to come out of the worst year of my life, it was the particular shape of family I ended up with on the other side of it. Priya, Ray, Diane, and Tom became something closer to a found family than a group of professional contacts, the 5 of us falling into an easy, unplanned rhythm of dinners every few months, first to debrief the latest court filing, later, once the legal dust settled, just because we genuinely liked each other's company by then. Priya hosted the first one at her place that spring, insisting on cooking everything herself despite Ray's teasing that a CFO should know better than to waste billable hours on homemade dumplings. And somewhere between the second and third course, I looked around that table and felt something I hadn't expected to feel again, so soon after everything. The specific, uncomplicated warmth of being surrounded by people who'd shown up for you. Not because they had to, but because they'd decided, individually, that you were worth showing up for. Tom, in particular, became someone I trusted in a way I hadn't trusted anyone new in years. Careful and understated, the kind of person who noticed when you needed space and gave it to you without making a show of the generosity. We started having coffee together every couple of weeks. Nothing romantic, at least not in that first year. Just two people who'd been through something intense together and found it easier to talk to each other about ordinary things afterward, precisely because neither of us needed to explain the backstory first. Diane once teased me gently over one of those group dinners that I'd built myself an entire new support system out of the exact people who'd helped me take my old life apart. I laughed, because she wasn't wrong, and because there was something almost poetic about it that I hadn't fully appreciated until she said it out loud. The people who helped me see clearly turned out to be the people worth keeping close permanently, not just for the length of a crisis. My relationship with my mother deepened that year, too, in ways I hadn't anticipated. She'd never been the type to say "I told you so," but she also hadn't been the type, historically, to get deeply involved in my marriage or my business, respecting a boundary she assumed I wanted kept. Once everything came out into the open, she started calling more, not to check up on me exactly, but just to talk. The way I imagined she and my father used to talk before he got sick, easy and unhurried. She told me once, over one of those calls, that she'd always sensed something was off with Dan, but had talked herself out of saying anything, afraid of overstepping, afraid of being the interfering mother-in-law she'd watched Patricia become over the years. "I regret that," she told me. "Not the discretion, the specific silence. There's a difference between respecting your daughter's marriage and staying quiet about something you can see clearly that she can't yet." I told her I understood, and that I didn't blame her for it, though I also told her gently that if she ever saw something like that again, in my life, or anyone else's, I'd rather hear it and disagree than never hear it at all. She's held me to that since, more than once, in smaller ways, and I've been grateful for it every time. There's a version of this story that would end with a tidy bow, some grand romantic gesture 2 years later, a rebuilt life crowned by a new relationship that erases the old one entirely, the kind of ending that plays well as a highlight reel. That's not quite how it went, and I've made a kind of peace with that over time. What actually happened in the 2 years since that rainy morning at the notary's office was slower and less cinematic than that, and I've come to think it's more honest for exactly that reason. I rebuilt a company. I rebuilt a sense of who I was outside of being somebody's wife. I built something durable out of the worst thing that ever happened to me, in the form of a legal clinic that now helps women I'll never personally meet untangle exactly the kind of fraud that almost cost me everything. None of that arrived wrapped in a single dramatic reveal. It arrived in years of Tuesday afternoons, ordinary meetings, small corrections, the unglamorous daily work of choosing, again and again, to keep building instead of collapsing. I think about Eli sometimes, more than I probably should given how little claim I actually have to any piece of his life now. I hope, wherever he ends up, that somebody eventually tells him the truth about all of it gently, in pieces he can actually absorb, rather than letting him stumble across some old news article on his own one day and reconstruct the worst version of his own origin story from headlines written by strangers who never met him. I hope Tessa manages to build something honest for him, whatever mistakes she made along the way to get there. Some people get a second chance at building a decent life after doing real damage to somebody else's. I've decided, at least where Eli is concerned, that I hope she takes hers seriously, for his sake, if not entirely for her own. As for Dan, I don't spend much time thinking about him anymore, which itself feels like the actual finish line, more than any courtroom verdict ever did. There was a period, right after the launch, where I thought closure would look like watching him sentenced, or reading some final apology that finally sounded sincere instead of self-serving. It turns out closure looked like something much quieter than that. It looked like a Tuesday morning, 18 months or so after everything happened, where I realized I'd gone an entire week without thinking about him even once, not out of suppression, just because my life had genuinely filled back up with other things worth thinking about instead. That's the actual ending, I think, the one nobody puts in a headline, not a dramatic confrontation, just an ordinary week, full of ordinary things, in a life that finally, quietly, belonged entirely to me again. People ask me sometimes, especially younger women just starting out in their own careers or their own marriages, what I'd tell my younger self if I could go back to that leaky sublet with the space heater and the 6 of us who thought we were building something invincible together. I've turned the question over enough times to have a real answer now instead of a platitude. I wouldn't tell her not to fall in love with Dan. I wouldn't tell her not to build the company, not to trust her team, not to help Tessa back in that Kentucky hollow all those years ago. Almost none of the choices that led to this story were bad choices in isolation. What I'd tell her is something closer to what my father actually tried to tell me, in his own gruff, unglamorous way, more than once, and that I only fully understood after paying for the lesson at a much higher price than I ever needed to. Build everything good in your life the way you'd build a house in a flood zone. Not because you expect the flood, because you respect what water can do to a structure that was never designed to survive it, no matter how much you loved the person who helped you pour the foundation. I keep a small framed photo on my office bookshelf now, not the wedding photo, which came down off the wall the week I moved out and never went back up anywhere, but a photo from that Kentucky trip with my father, the 2 of us standing in front of the rental car in that cold hollow, his hand on my shoulder, both of us squinting into weak winter sun. I keep it there not as a reminder of Tessa, or of everything that eventually went wrong because of a decision made in that valley. I keep it there because it's the last clear photo I have of my father actually teaching me something in real time, before I understood I was supposed to be paying closer attention. Every time a new client walks into the clinic now, shaking, holding a folder of documents they don't fully understand yet, I think of that photo before I think of anything else. Somewhere behind every fraud, every betrayal, every fake divorce filing hidden inside a stack of routine paperwork, there's usually a version of that same cold valley, someone desperate enough or greedy enough to reach for whatever leverage is closest at hand. My father taught me that kindness needs a fence around it. It took me most of a decade, and $35 million, and one unforgettable morning at a notary's office to finally build mine properly. I'd rather hand the blueprint to somebody else now than watch her build it the hard way, the way I did, one betrayal at a time. Marlene's part in all of it turned out to be smaller and sadder than I'd braced myself for. When Diane and Tom finally sat her down for a formal interview, weeks before the launch, she broke down almost immediately, insisting she'd never known what the sealed envelopes from the county clerk actually contained. Dan had told her, she said, that they were routine filings related to a corporate restructuring, sensitive enough that he wanted them handed to him directly rather than left in the general mail sorting, a request that hadn't struck her as strange coming from the company's own CTO. She hadn't asked questions because asking questions had never been part of her job, and because Dan had a way, she admitted quietly, of making requests sound so ordinary that refusing them felt like it would be the strange, suspicious choice instead. Tom believed her. And so, eventually, did I. She wasn't part of the fraud. She was one more small, unwitting gear in a machine somebody else had built entirely for his own benefit, the same way Ethan had been. The same way, in a much larger sense, I had been myself for 9 years. I didn't fire her. I moved her, instead, into a different administrative role with less direct access to sensitive mail, not as a punishment, but because it seemed unfair to leave her holding a job that had already been quietly weaponized against her once, without her ever understanding how. I think about the actual afternoon Dan handed me that leather portfolio more often than almost any other single memory from those years, replaying it slowly now that I understand every detail I missed at the time. My father had been readmitted to the ICU 2 days earlier. I remember the particular quality of my exhaustion that week, a kind of static behind my eyes that made even simple sentences take an extra beat to process. Dan came into my office around 4 in the afternoon, set the portfolio down without ceremony, and said easily, "Need you to sign a few things. Funding round's got a stack of addendums." I remember asking, half out of habit, half out of genuine tiredness, whether anything in there was important. I remember him laughing, light and unbothered, the exact tone he used for things that genuinely didn't matter. "Wouldn't need your signature if it wasn't, but it's all internal boilerplate. Just sign, so we hit the deadline." I signed 12 pages that afternoon in under 4 minutes, glancing at headers, trusting the man across the desk from me more than I trusted my own eyes to catch something wrong. Somewhere in that stack, buried between genuine funding paperwork, sat a divorce petition and a property settlement agreement, formatted just closely enough to the rest of the documents that a rushed, grieving woman wouldn't think to look twice. I've read a great deal about coercive control since then, about how effective it becomes specifically at moments of maximum exhaustion and grief, when the part of your brain responsible for scrutiny is already fully occupied, surviving something else entirely. Dan didn't invent that tactic. He simply had the patience and the coldness to wait for exactly the right week to use it. Looking back on the whole arc of that year, I've come to think of it less as a single betrayal and more as a slow accumulation of small permissions I gave away without noticing, one at a time, each one small enough on its own to seem harmless. Permission to not ask too many questions about a blank stretch in Tessa's life. Permission to sign a stack of documents without reading every page, because reading every page felt, in the moment, like an insult to a marriage I still believed was solid. Permission to let one person hold every key to a company's core infrastructure, because distributing that trust felt, at the time, like an unnecessary bureaucratic hurdle between friends who'd built something together from nothing. None of those permissions felt dangerous in isolation. Stacked on top of each other over 9 years, they built a structure with exactly one load-bearing wall, and Dan turned out to be standing directly underneath it the whole time, quietly deciding when to knock it down. I think about my father's fence a great deal these days, more than I probably think about anything else from those years. He wasn't warning me, back in that motel room in Kentucky, against helping people. He built his entire life around helping people, quietly, without cameras, in ways that actually changed outcomes rather than just generating a good feeling for the person doing the helping. What he was warning me against was helping people without also protecting the structure that made the helping possible in the first place. A woman who gives away every ounce of her trust, her money, her attention, without ever checking whether it's landing somewhere honest, isn't generous so much as she's unguarded, and the world does not reliably reward unguarded people. It occasionally punishes them severely instead, and calls the punishment their own fault for having been naive enough to trust in the first place, as though naivety were the crime, and not whatever crime got committed against it. I don't say any of that with bitterness anymore, which surprised me, honestly, once I noticed it was true. There's a version of this story where I close the loop still furious, still scanning every new relationship for a hidden angle, still treating every kind gesture as a potential opening for exploitation. I didn't want to become that version of myself, and I worked hard, with Dr. Alvarez's help and a fair amount of trial and error on my own, to make sure the vigilance I kept from that year got installed alongside my capacity for trust, rather than in place of it. I still help people. I still believe most people, most of the time, are exactly who they say they are. I just don't hand anyone the keys to my whole life anymore, without a very clear-eyed sense of what happens if I'm wrong about them, and I've built enough structural checks into both my company and my own personal life that being wrong about somebody, if it ever happens again, costs me a bruise, instead of everything I've built. One rainy afternoon, a little over 2 years after that morning at the Notary, I stood in my new office on the 16th floor, looking out at the Chicago skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows, the same kind of gray autumn light that had been sitting over Wacker Drive the day this whole thing started. I thought about that morning often, the plastic chair, the notary's reading glasses, the 5 seconds of total silence before I found the one thing worth doing next. At the time, I genuinely believed that was the day my life ended. It took me a long while afterward to understand it wasn't. It was the day I woke up. The lesson I carry out of all of it, the one I try to hand to every woman who walks through the door of the clinic my father's name is still attached to, is simple enough to fit on one line. Even if it took me 9 years and $35 million worth of inheritance to actually learn it properly. A woman can love deeply. She can sacrifice enormously, work herself half to death building something with another person, and still be right to do all of that. But she should never, under any circumstances, hand over every key to her own life in the process, not to a husband, not to a company, not to anyone. Kindness without a fence around it eventually becomes a ladder for somebody ungrateful to climb over you with. And trust, placed carelessly in the wrong hands, stops being a gift at all. It turns, quietly, patiently, over however many years it takes, into a blade aimed directly at your back, held by someone who spent all that time learning exactly where to aim it.